Hey everybody, James Shepard here with the Merchant Sales Podcast. My co-host Patty Murphy is not with me today, but we have a really interesting interview with James Huber, who's an attorney, and we're talking about the Credit Card Competition Act of 2022, and we're going to dive into all the details there. So we're going to have a very different episode today because it's a little bit of a longer interview because it's frankly a very complicated and very important topic. But I told my friend there that I said, hey, at the end of the interview, I said, hey, I'm going to do a little intro for this. And I want to start off today by giving you a little primer on how the credit card processing industry works. So if you're a longtime veteran and you want to skip ahead a little bit, go for it. But if you just want to understand some of the basics, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. I promise it won't take long. But I realize that when we get into this rather complicated conversation about the Credit Card Competition Act and the results of it, it'd be easy for us to just dive into that, and some of our listeners would have really no idea what we're talking about. So I'm going to answer a couple of key questions. Then we're going to dive right into our interview with James Huber. Okay. So number one, what is interchange and what is the role of Visa and Mastercard in the interchange? So when we talk about the cost for the merchant, so we go out, we sell a pizza shop, they do $10,000 a month in credit card processing volume, and there is a cost to process those transactions. Now, I'm not in this case talking about the cost to the merchant. You might have the merchant on flat rate pricing at 3.5%. You might have the merchant on interchange plus pricing or tiered pricing. So I'm not talking about the fees the merchant pays. I'm talking about the underlying cost of being able to process those transactions. So just like any other business in the payments industry, we have cost. We price above our cost to generate a profit. So for that pizza shop that has, 10,000 in processing volume, they're probably going to be running somewhere around 1.8 to 2% of that volume, of that card processing volume. They're going to be running as interchange cost. Okay. What is interchange cost? Well, interchange is a cost that is determined by a very, very complicated document. You could go download for free online if you look up the Visa interchange table and just download and take a look at it. But there are several criteria based on the type of card. Is it a platinum rewards money back card? Is it a regulated debit card? Depending on the type of card, there's going to be a different interchange rate. Also, depending on the type of business, was the card swiped at a grocery store or a gas station or a restaurant? Depending on the type of business, there's a different interchange cost for running that transaction. Thirdly, and the other primary one would be the method of entry. So was this an e-commerce transaction where it was online? Was it keyed in on a virtual terminal? Was it inserted, have a swipe or insert of the card at the physical location? What was the method of entry? So when you look at those three variables, those are used to create the interchange cost, and that's how interchange is calculated. Now, the question is, who sets interchange and who collects interchange? Well, the interchange is actually paid to or collected by the issuing bank, the bank that issues the card. Whoever issued that card, they are the ones who get to keep that interchange revenue. But the interchange is actually set by the card brands Visa and Mastercard. Now, obviously, there's going to be some collaboration there. Some would even say collusion between the card brands and the banks, the issuing banks, to set the interchange rates. However, those interchange rates are set. Now, in America, we have really not had very much activity in terms of regulating interchange. We talked last week about the Durbin Amendment, which regulated the interchange specifically on debit cards from big banks. But other than that, as far as credit card transactions, there's been no regulation. And this is very different from the rest of the world. When you look at Europe, when you look at even Canada has some, I wouldn't say really stringent regulation, but they do regulate it. When you look at the EU, when you look at France, Germany, when you look at Australia, you're going to see that the interchange cost in those countries is going to be significantly lower. I'm not talking about 10% lower. I'm talking about 70% lower, 80% lower in a lot of cases than it is here in the US. Why? Because the government has regulated the cost of interchange in those countries. So I'm not advocating for or against that right now. We're going to get into that in the podcast. I'm just letting you know the reality of the market. That's how it works. So that's the interchange, and that's the bulk of the cost. Now, how does Visa and Mastercard, how do they make money? Well, they have a totally separate set of fees that they charge in order to have access to their network. So think of Visa and Mastercard. They are these network providers And you say, well, what are they networking together? Well, what they're networking together is the issuing bank and the acquiring bank. And for those of you that are really experts, bear with me. I realize I'm oversimplifying this significantly, but Visa and MasterCard, somebody has to tie these things together. So when I go to use my credit card and I fly to LA on a business trip and I use my card at a restaurant there, how does my bank that issued me my card back in Pennsylvania, how are they going to know that I'm trying to use my card? How are they going to communicate with the restaurant to say, James has enough money that he can use his card, right? It's approved. How are they going to get the money from the bank in Pennsylvania to the merchant's bank in Los Angeles, right? So the issuing bank is the one who issues the card. The acquiring bank is the bank for the merchant. So they handle moving the money to the merchant's account to make sure the merchant has money. So we have the consumer's bank and we have the merchant's bank, or we have the buyer and the seller, and we have to tie them together somehow. Well, enter Visa and MasterCard. That's what they do. They allow, through their network and their incredible security, and they do a lot of amazing things, but they enable that point of sale system or credit card machine or e-commerce gateway or whatever it is, swiper on the phone. They enable that at the point of sale. They enable this transaction to be able to securely be routed to say, okay, we see this card, and Visa says, okay, we know based on the first few digits of the card number, we know the BIN or the bank identification number. So we're going to go ask the bank through our automated network and say, hey, James is trying to spend $100 in Los Angeles. So Visa reaches out to my bank in Pennsylvania that issues the card and says, does James have $100 of available credit? And my bank says, yes, he does. Then Visa says, okay. So then they say, hold that money to the issuing bank, and they issue a Visa authorization code to the acquiring bank and to the processor and say, hey, all right, this is an approved transaction. Here's your authorization code, right? Then at the end of the day, the processor, through the acquiring bank, is going to have to settle the transactions. They're going to say, okay, here's all the transactions with the authorization codes. We're going to send the ones we're going to route them to the appropriate issuing bank. So the issuing bank can then send the money, less the interchange fees. They can send that money to the acquiring bank. And so I wanted you to just have a really, really high level view. That is how the industry currently works. Okay. Again, I'm not making any sides of how it should work or changes that should be made or not made, but I just want to give you a broad, understanding of this idea that Visa and MasterCard, as well as Discover and American Express to a much lesser extent, which I won't get into here, but Visa and MasterCard are these primary. They have about 83% of all the credit card transactions run through Visa or MasterCard, and their network is what ties this all together and makes it all work. And so it's the part of the industry that we kind of take for granted that it's going to work, and that's what they do. So that's your kind of 101 on the industry. Okay. Now that you understand the kind of just basics of like, this is Interchange, this is what the card brands do, this is the issuing bank, this is the acquiring bank. Now that you understand that piece of it, now let's dive into the interview with James Huber, and let's talk about this latest attempt by Dick Durbin, who's the author of the Durbin Amendment that we discussed last week. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, you probably want to go listen to that first before you listen to this one. It kind of, it's like a running start. Okay. Then Dick Durbin now is trying to regulate credit cards, and he wants to do it in a way that honestly, I never imagined. I saw this coming a mile away that there would be regulation. I talked about it in like a year ago, but I thought that they would try to regulate it the way everybody else has, which is with price fixing and saying, okay, the maximum you can do on a credit card is X, that you can't go any higher than X. But instead, they have introduced this very unique bill. It's very controversial. Even in my own head, I go back and forth on it, on how terrible is it? Could it be good? It's really an interesting thing. So we're going to talk to an actual attorney about this, who's read the regulation, read the law that's being presented, not the regulation, the law that's being presented, the amendment. And so we're going to talk about that today. So let's go ahead and transition over to our interview with James Huber. Before we do that, don't forget, this episode is brought to you by none other than NMI, NMI.com. You got to check them out. They are a fantastic gateway solution. I actually just did a really interesting merchant sales insight that came out. You're listening to this on Friday. It came out 3 days ago on Wednesday. So make sure you watch that one, talking about the transformation of the ISO to more of a tech-centric organization and the role that NMI can play in that. But if you want to learn more about having a great technology partner to navigate these changing, crazy times in our industry, go to nmi.com and check it out. They are the proud sponsor of the Merchant Sales Podcast. And with that, let's start talking to James Huber in our interview today. Everybody, James Shepard here with my good friend James Huber. How you doing today, James?
I'm doing well. Thanks, James.
Awesome. So we are going to talk today about one of the hottest stories in payments, which is the Credit Card Competition Act that's gone through various iterations. We're going to talk about the regulation, what it would mean for our industry. Before we do that, though, for those that maybe haven't, I know you've been on our podcast many times, but for those that haven't listened before, tell us who you are and kind of what you do a little bit as far as understanding what your role is in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. My law firm, Global Legal Law Firm, has been operating the payment space pretty much exclusively for about the last 15 years now. And we started representing sales agents, and now, we represent some of the processors and banks and various other entities. But our niche is still helping out sales agents with their agreements and hopefully avoiding litigation. But when it happens, we're the guy to go to also.
Sure. So we're going to dive in today to this Credit Card Competition Act, which again, it's gone through different iterations, which we'll talk about as a standalone and then as an amendment. Before we do that, last week we talked to Elena Smith about the Durbin Amendment and kind of that leading to what Dick Durbin is now presenting as this new one. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on the Durbin Amendment. We got about 10 years on it. How did it impact the industry? Anything about it that you thought was going to go differently? Just kind of curious to hear your insights on the Durbin Amendment itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty controversial. Like we're 10 years in, people want to repeal it. Some people hate it, but the big major retailers, they love it. The big ticket items, it really helped them. Where it hurt, is little coffee shops. A $2 cup of coffee, when you could get a $2 cup of coffee back in 2010, had a 10% fee on it. It's also touted with killing rewards programs on debit cards. I don't know if everyone remembers, it used to get, tons of rewards on debit cards.
Right.
But it was effective that it created a lot of opportunities in this space. Elena discussed how a bunch of fintechs popped up, and one of the things that I love that's all the rage right now is discounting. And discounting was born, it was called the Debit discount program originally, and that was born out of this to pass along that debit fee. And people did not like discounting in the beginning. When you're buying that $2 cup of coffee and now it costs $2.25, you're actually going, well, wait a minute.
Right.
Now it's all the rage, and it's one of the reasons I get excited about this legislation. Any change in our industry creates opportunities, and everybody that listens to your podcast, they're listening to it to look for these changes because they have their head on a swivel. They're going to see an opportunity and they're going to jump in, and this is going to do the same thing.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's start with a high level view. So what is the Credit Card Competition Act? What is it? What's at a high level? What is it trying to accomplish in our industry?
High level, this is trying to, I can back up. Durbin, he's got it out for Visa and Mastercard, and rightly so. This is, the Hill doing a monopoly buster here, trying to do it through legislation. So, Visa and Mastercard, they are too big. In this industry, every single thing touches them almost. So I think he's coming straight at Visa and Mastercard. And the legislation, we were talking about this before the podcast, it doesn't say Visa and Mastercard, but the definition, we got confused on the definition of this. Does it apply to the bank? No, it is Visa and Mastercard. I'm coming for you.
Yes.
So this proposed legislation says that you've got to have more than one network, and it can't be Visa or Mastercard. So you have to have Visa and Star, Pulse, Interlink, or one of the other ones, or all the other ones that pop up, or Mastercard or a fallback.
Yeah. Now, what do you think Durbin, obviously we know he's trying to accomplish, like you mentioned, kind of breaking up this duopoly, right? We'll call it. So trying to break this up. Are there other objectives that you think he's trying to accomplish? Are there other things do you think he like, what's the motivation behind this? Is it just about breaking up Visa MasterCard, or do you think there's other motivating factors for him?
Well, look, it's hard to know who's pulling the strings for these guys. I think for Durbin, he's straight going at Visa and MasterCard, but his justification, well, one of his justifications was this is going to help veterans because they're processing cards. So he tried to tack it on to the defense spending bill, which is a must-pass bill that has to pass every year. So he tried to put it on there, but with 900 other amendments tried to do that too. But he's saying, the proponents are saying that this is going to help retailers and it's going to pass along those fees to consumer. Now they said that about Durbin too, and that's not what happened. But the proponents are saying that the average swipe fee is 7 to 10 times higher than it is in Europe and China. So
which is true.
So let's get that down, and retailers can lower their price. But look, over the last 2 years, we all learned retailers needed a break. So if it only goes to the retailers, to the small businesses, great. That's good for everybody too.
Right. And I think the big debate is, would it make it to them? Right. So like, is Square going to lower their rate because their interchange cost goes down? Maybe that competition would trickle down. Right. And so like we saw that with Durbin, there was like the Durbin Amendment, there was like, you probably remember there was probably this like 4 or 5 month windfall profit where like everybody that had flat rate tiered pricing was like, great, we love the Durbin Amendment, let's leave it alone.
We love it.
They made an extra 40 basis points, but then, it did come down. I remember really vividly, like probably 4 or 5 months after Durbin Amendment, a lot of companies started rolling out 4-tier pricing. It used to always be 3-tier: qualified, mid-qualified, non-qualified. And then it was like qualified debit versus qualified credit. And there was this difference.
Right.
And that was their way to be competitive and beat the competition. And so maybe that competitiveness, that competitive nature would trickle down in some way. I don't know if you see that happening, but I thought about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, my thought on that is, right before like all the POS technology came along and there were more opportunities in the space to sell to merchants, all I heard was this is a race to zero profit of pricing accounts. We're just going out and look, all we've been selling for years is fees. And then technology came along and you're going, oh, I'm selling technology. And then, the Squares come along, you go, well, I'm going to sell customer service and technology. But, as far as those rates making it, I think they could. I mean, you've got an opportunity here to go into a mom and pop shop and say, I can give you 1.5% processing using this. So, arguably it could be the wild, wild west again.
Yeah. It's interesting that this amendment, if it was to pass, really would create so much uncertainty. And I think, my issue with it, because I agree with you that, and I've said it many, many times, that Visa and MasterCard do have a bit of a stranglehold on the industry. And it's, it's not that I'm against any way that, we could make the industry more competitive. I'm, a free market capitalist. I love competition. I do think companies can get so large, they have a little too much control. My issue with it has been the practicality. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm really struggling to visualize how on earth this will work. Like, you know what I'm saying? That's I guess my two issues with it. One is that, and the other issue is, do we need more competition? It's like, well, yes, Visa, MasterCard, I think it's like 83% of all credit card transactions are Visa and MasterCard. But, it's like, we're just looking at credit cards. What about P2P, Venmo, Zelle, ACH, crypto? So there are a lot of external factors as well that I think are providing that. So I don't know, I guess what I was curious to hear your thoughts on would be, when you look at this thing and you read through it, is there anything that popped out to you and you're kind of like, I don't know, this is great, or like, how would this work? Or I don't know, just kind of curious your thoughts on the practicality of this thing, of like, even if it passes, like, is this even possible? Like, I don't know. That was my main concern.
Yeah, I mean that's a big one. One, is it possible to get this thing to pass,
Right.
to get people to vote on it? I mean, in the definitions, and I got confused reading this. It calls out the issuing bank, and one of the reasons I thought that maybe it died as a standalone bill was you're going to regulate the banks. What are you talking about? You stay away,
Right.
because we all know we can't touch the banks. They're, holding everything together with, the big facade that they actually have your money. So,
Right.
because I think some people don't totally understand, the bank does not have your money. The bank has maybe 10% of your money that's in
Right.
there. Then they go loan it and loan it and loan it. Which, as an aside, I always laugh when people are like, crypto's a Ponzi scheme. And I'm like, the banks are the biggest Ponzi scheme.
Right.
So
Right.
when you have legislation calling out, I'm going to go regulate something about the banks, I can
Right.
see everybody sitting back and going, whoa. And
Yeah.
then the other reason I think that, what stuck out to me also is this is confusing stuff. You're going to regulate Visa and MasterCard. I think a lot of people go, they have no idea what they do.
Right.
So getting these, legislatures who have a lot on their plate, they're reading all these bills or getting them read to them, they don't understand. So if you and I have been doing this for years, we're reading this thing and going, how is this going to work?
Right.
How's it going to work? How
Yeah.
are you guys going to put this together? And how are you going to box in Visa and MasterCard, who are making the world go round, to actually not figure out loopholes to this? And we were
Right.
chuckling beforehand at how they really tried to box them in, saying, there's no way around this.
Right.
They're
It's like
big
how much
companies.
do you want to bet they're going to find a way around it, right?
How much do you want to bet they're going to find a way around it, or they're going to, it's not going to hit their margin? I mean, they're saying it's going to cost them, hundreds of billions of dollars. I
Unlikely.
got a feeling they'll figure out a way to keep that
Yeah.
margin up.
Well, I'll tell you, the two things about it that struck me as kind of hilarious in a way, just for the lack of understanding. One was just the definition of a network. It's kind of hilarious to me that, when I read it, I just read it again this morning, and it's like, we're going to originate a transaction on one network, and you're going to have to be able to send it through a different network. And it's like that fundamentally disagrees with the concept of a network. A network connects 2 points. You can't start it at one point and say we're gonna like that. What does that even mean? So that was funny to me. And the other one that I thought was really interesting, almost comical, was they said in there that these defined entities, which we know are Visa and MasterCard, they can't restrict anybody, including acquirers, processors, banks, the whole thing. They can't restrict anybody from using different networks for a card transaction, even if that transaction is tokenized. Well, if you understand tokenization at all, the idea of tokenization is you have these 2 points in a network and they both have the same encryption key. And the whole reason it's secure in the first place is that they're the only two that have the encryption key. So, it's like they're trying to change the fundamental nature of not only the card, the card, processing, but also the fundamental definition of security. Like,
Yeah.
this is going to open up very interesting security implications, I would imagine. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, of kind of just the, again, more the practicality of it, but that was kind of my thought of reading through it. Was like, man, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the big things that stuck out. I mean, look, we have, verified, existing networks that could, excuse me, come in and fill this void, but other ones are going to pop up, and we're going, competition's good, but yeah, security.
Right.
Visa and MasterCard, I believe, have it pretty dialed at this point. We all know nothing's secured. If somebody wants to get in, they'll get in.
Right.
But I've got to imagine, they've got this pretty dialed. And when you have other people coming in and they actually have to, like you said, key into this network,
Right.
Right there, this happens in crypto all the time when they do the forking of the network. And every single time it happens, $500 million goes missing.
Right.
So what happens when they are rewriting the systems? I mean, that's what you hit it on the head of the part where people should be scratching their heads, but I guarantee the people that are voting on this won't understand what you just said right there. And they're going, yeah, good. Okay, look, let's look at this side. They're saying, this will hurt poorer communities. And this side is saying this will help major retailers, which is, also good.
Right.
They won't get into that piece. So
No,
yeah, there's going to be some tinkering needed here. But at the same time, you've got really smart payments companies. I think they would figure it out.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, if there's money at stake, which there would be in this case, massive money at stake.
Massive money at stake. And look at these crypto companies coming up. These are, very wealthy companies, but they're doing it.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, I mean, it has taken 10, almost 11 years, but they are finally starting to figure out what this means for debit from the Durbin Amendment that regulated that, hey, you got it. You know what I mean? Like literally, it was like I think a month ago that it finally came out with the ruling and like, okay, here's what you have to do by July of 2023, and so they're figuring it out. I mean, it takes a long time, I think, for the regulators. I think the timeline, if it did pass, I think the timeline, the 1 to 3 years, they kind of said like within 1 year this has to happen, and then kind of within 3 years these other. I mean, I think that's going to be more like 5 and 10 years. Yeah. That was my thought. I mean, I'd be really, really surprised if they were able to get any kind of momentum whatsoever. Because the other thing I thought of is this, is it just me, or in order for any company to compete and be innovative here, they are going to have to connect directly into Visa and MasterCard's network. Like if the transactions are originating there, so Visa and MasterCard are going to have to give access. So this is kind of, in a way, this regulation is saying, Visa and MasterCard, you're going to have to allow other private companies to gain access to your encrypted data so that they can reroute your transaction to their network. Well, I would imagine that Visa and MasterCard are going to put up quite the fight legally and everything else to doing so, because, right? Like they're going to say, well, how do we know if it's secure? I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of stall tactics, I guess I would say, for Visa and MasterCard there. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, 100%, because if we back up, where's the regulation in this space? It's the card brand rules. And specifically, it's Visa and MasterCard's card brand rules.
Right.
I don't go look at American Express's card brand rules all that often.
Right.
I look at Visa and MasterCard. So they have all of these rules that will prohibit this because it's going to run into data security. And I'm sure, whoever's plugging into this will be PCI and everything like that. But yeah, that's the nightmare part of this, where you're going, no, this actually won't work. But I could see Durbin going, exactly. I'm going to ruffle your guys' feathers.
Right.
I am fighting for you. Because you remember, I can't remember when, but it was some point during COVID when they said, they're getting ready to raise their rates, and Durbin raised his eyebrow. Never mind.
Right.
So I go, he's got an axe to grind with Visa and MasterCard. And that's, what we don't really know why. There could be any number of reasons why with these guys. I don't want to throw mud, but it could be, he's got shares in Pulse Network or something like that. Who knows?
I would imagine if he had shares in Pulse or something, probably he would go to jail, right? If he
No, these guys are allowed to inside trade. So, that's my thing is, look, he seems like he's, pretty altruistic public servant, but why so hard at Visa and MasterCard? Is it just because he understands? Because if I get elected to, some office where I'm making laws like this, there's a bunch of things that I would want to change. There's a bunch of things that we would all want to change. How about we put regulations on processors, charging early termination fees and things like that. So Yeah, I would like to know, maybe we'll get him on the next podcast of, what's your angle? Why Visa? Why Mastercard? And why do you, gun in for them so hard?
Yeah. All right. So as we kind of wrap this up here, let's assume we have a crystal ball, and let's assume that this thing does pass. So I think, again, I think not only does it pass, but it passes and somehow we figure out how to implement it. So those are really the big questions. But
Yeah.
let's assume for a second that it passed and we figured out how to deal with it. So we now have this new ecosystem of unaffiliated networks. So a couple of questions for you there. Number one, and we touched on it already. I mean, do you have any thoughts on who this unaffiliated network would be? Do you see it as more of the upstart companies that would come in and figure this out? Or do you see it as like Discover or American Express or like the debit networks, or any thoughts on kind of like where it would go if it actually passed and somehow the technology side was figured out? I mean, who's this unaffiliated network, or who's that going to be?
Yeah. I'd love to see the startups coming in, because they will innovate the way that, the system operates. And maybe, who knows, they could blow these guys out of the water. What if I really am paying 1% and still getting rewards because it's, a bunch of VC money? We've seen I had a bunch of clients, develop virtual wallets for their debit card, where, you've got your debit card on your phone, or, they can give you a real debit card that's still cranking out rewards, using these smaller banks after Durbin. So I see, the existing networks coming in, the debit networks and all that, because they've got the rails set up, they know what they're doing, and they're there. But yeah, I'd love to see new companies coming in. And we've seen it with crypto. It's not all that difficult for these companies to do. If, I'll open up my Coinbase and there's a gajillion different coins you can buy, and whether or not those, all operate. I know that at least a couple hundred of them do operate, where they have rails and they're exchanging information and money and things like that. So yeah, I don't think it's as hard. The people talking about this are saying, yeah, there's existing people out there that are doing this now, and yeah, let's see what, who pops up. So the issue is, look, we're after Visa and Mastercard because we don't like what they're doing, and they get to call the shots. What if the new guys come in and they're worse? What if they're, hiking rates or charging phantom fees? Yeah. There's not a lot of oversight here. Like I said, we have the card brand rules. Right. But I've been in court in front of judges, federal judges, state judges all over the country. And I'll, hold up the card brand rules and be like, Your Honor, they're violating the card brand rules. Are those laws? Well, no, Your Honor, but it's all we got, So right. If they're not, if those are now weakened even more, my job just got a lot harder. Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually hadn't even thought about that idea that we have this, in our industry, we have these kind of de facto laws, but they're not laws. And, and all of a sudden, if Visa and Mastercard lose control, that also, and I'll tell you, it's interesting you bring this up. This is kind of my other concern, frankly, which is a bit of a slippery slope. So what would happen there, right? So if we have these other networks coming in, Visa and Mastercard lose their grip a bit, and all of a sudden we do have this wild, wild west where the card brand rules don't seem to apply as much anymore. What happens next? Well, now we have further regulation. Now the government needs to step in and say, whoa, hold on. We need to regulate pricing. Well, now we're the mortgage industry where I have tons and tons of friends that 10 years ago had a great business in the mortgage broker industry. Almost all of them have left. There's no money to make there anymore. It's all regulated now. Right. And so was it good? Well, yeah, there were a lot of bad players there that were taking advantage of people, and now they're not. That's good. But there were also a ton of, people that were doing a good job, but now through the regulation, it's like, well, now that's over for the most part. And so that's my other concern, I guess, is kind of like everything about this bill to me feels a little bit like a slippery slope. And I mean, I think it would take a decade to go down the hill that far. But I mean, it's like, at what point is it like, well, okay, we implemented all this
interchange rates went down, but Square is still charging what they're charging, Levon and TSYS and FIS and Fiserv were all charging kind of what they were anyway. So we ended up putting a ton of money in the pockets of Walmart, Amazon, Target, and in all the big processors. And that was the net effect. If that becomes the net effect of this legislation, I feel pretty certain that Mr. Durbin is going to be setting his sights on the ISO world, the processor, the acquirer world very quickly to say, whoa, hold on. This didn't even get to the people I wanted it to go to. It's time to, you know what I mean? I don't know what your thoughts on that, but that's one of my kind of concerns / I guess observations. Maybe it should happen. I don't know, but that's a concern.
Yeah, I mean, look, I fell in love with this industry because it was wild. I joked I have a joke when I'm interviewing attorneys to come to our office. I was like, when we first got in the industry, a bunch of our clients, I think they watched the first 3/4 of Wolf of Wall Street and then got bored, so they didn't see how it ended. It was fun. This industry creates an opportunity for you to create a lifestyle where you get to do what you want to do. You can make a ton of money. It's recurring. You can hire all your friends and families and childhood friends and everybody, and overpay them because of the opportunities here. Regulation can tamp that down, but at the same time, we have no regulation in this space. Right. Like I said, when I'm in court and I'm going, they are breaking every single rule there is. And they're going, are they violating any laws? And I'm like, pretty much. Which ones, It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to know where the walls were, with regulation. And I'm not talking about this one, this doesn't, I think this will affect the ISO space. I'm going, I think you'll be able to run into stores and offer way lower rates, hopefully. But having some guidance on where we should operate. I mean, maybe this is me, as my, trying to convince judges that things need to happen going on, works. But at the same time, it also does kind of self-govern a little bit. You have a lot of competition. You have a lot of people watch your podcast, and it kind of brute wolf mentality. You figure out what the operating rules are, and the bad players most of the time get washed out unless they get too big.
Right. Well, and it's like I said last week. Short term. I talked to a lot of the ISO execs and things like that, and it's like, oh, this would just ruin us. And I'm like, well, actually, you would make a fortune off of it, like initially, right? So to me, there's only two concerns, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. This will be our last question, because we could talk about this for another hour. But so my last question is, the two risks that I see for the ISO agent acquirer world right now, and then I want to hear your thoughts on these two, and maybe you have some others. The two things that they should be concerned about would be, number one is the security and the dependability of the ecosystem. That's my number one concern initially, would be if this passes, all of a sudden it's like, we had the big Clover outage, and then we've had other, networks are going to have outages, right? But it's been I don't even remember the last time that the Visa or Mastercard network went down where you couldn't run a Visa transaction. I predict that will happen. Like, we are going to upset the foundational infrastructure of what we've all just taken for granted for the last decades, right? That oh, well, when you run a Visa transaction, you get an authorization code back. That just works. Well, that might break. That's a concern, because all of a sudden now we're tinkering with this core stuff. So that is the initial concern I have, is just the practicality of making this work. And if the government is going to regulate and say, okay, Visa and Mastercard, you have to let these other companies tinker with what you built. Well, that's scary. I don't know your thoughts.
I think that's very scary. And I think it goes back to what you brought up earlier is, Visa and Mastercard, let's say somebody needs to plug in and they go, oh, ow, and they're, doing FIFA and they're rolling around on the ground saying, oh, we can't do this. It's not going to work. Nice work, guys. You messed it up. Global commerce is dead for the next 7 hours. imagine what that does. We haven't seen Visa or, Mastercard go down, but I remember, I think it was it was like 4 years ago now, maybe TSYS went down for 4 days and didn't settle transactions. And we can all raise our eyebrows and go, wow, they have a lot of money in their bank account for 4 days. I wonder what they did with it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that, if Visa and Mastercard want to play a game, they absolutely could here. But yeah, with these other networks coming up, what if they go down? Because you see it in the crypto space all the time. That these things go down. And I think that is a really good point.
The truth is, I mean, as somebody that has a team of developers, I mean, it takes, decades of development work to think through the possible things that can go wrong and to make a really, really solid system with all the right safeguards. I mean, it's just really, there's no way to plan and execute that. You just have to fail, and then you fix the failure, and then you fix that failure, and then you fix the next failure, and then you start thinking about other failures you could have. And it's just a process. It just takes a long time. And, while I agree that Visa and Mastercard have a bit of a stranglehold, and it would be nice if we could loosen that a bit, they've gotten pretty good at it, so like you brought that up earlier, right? So that's one. And the other concern is what we just talked about, which is the slippery slope of regulation, where I agree with you. And I think about even like Jerron Rice and others who in their state, like Jerron has bills that he put through that got passed through the Maryland House about the early termination fees and, limiting that in the state of Maryland. So it's like, that's good. I like that. And I think there's some good things to do there. If the Competition Act becomes the Anti-Competition Act and here's the price fixing and all of that, to me, that's my concern long-term, is that we slip towards that. So any other thoughts your side on implications for the ISO agent world, and should we be doing anything as an industry to protect our interests? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, the good news is anyone listening to this podcast, they're doing what they should be doing. You got your head on a swivel. This will create, if this passes, it didn't pass as the tack on to this, but he's going, I'm just going to tack it on to the next one. Right. And like I said, this one, it didn't make it through because 900 other amendments tried to cram through this little door. And, I think this one's confusing. But there will be winners and losers here. And this will shake things up drastically. One, even like you said, people are looking all of a sudden. Think of where the money goes to startups when I go to a table and I go, hey, I got this network. I just need $100 million. And now by legislation, I get to compete with Visa and Mastercard. Sounds good. Go for it.
Right.
How this trickles down to the agents, I've said it before, you might be able to go out and offer really lower pricing. It could be another Wild West situation where also, it might take a while for merchants to know they're used to paying 3, 4, 5, 6%. What if your margin is 5% all of a sudden? We're back to the 2000s when you're throwing a knuckle buster in somebody's shop. So
yeah,
I think the big thing is, keep your head on a swivel, keep listening to your podcast, keep reading about what's going on and see what your, mind comes up with. There's going to be opportunities here to make a lot of money for different companies. So, I'm with you, regulation, I go either way, but any change in this industry has proven time over time to be really good for the industry. Really good.
Point. That's a good point. Yeah. Well, James, it's always such a pleasure to have you on. Before we jump off, I definitely want to give a quick plug for you. Frankly, and I think you know this, anytime an agent ISO comes to me and says, we need an attorney, especially now that dual pricing, cash discounting, surcharging, all of that has created a lot of uncertainty as well. Invariably, I send them over to you. And so tell us how our audience can reach out to you if they're in need of an attorney for a variety of things related to the industry. How do they get in contact with you and learn more?
Yeah, they can check out our website. It's globallegallawfirm.com or just email me direct, jhuber@attorneygl.com. And like I said, we love working with agents, I see it as the lifeblood of this industry and something that does not go away. For a couple of years, we thought we're going out, the agents are done because you're going to Square, Stripe. No, we're too nimble of a group. And I appreciate it, James. Thank you.
Love it. Well, James, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your insights and have a fantastic rest of your day.
All right. Thank you.